Col Max Hammond got his pilot wings in September 1941, which is before Pearl Harbor. For you youngsters back there, get your parents to explain to you what Pearl Harbor was. All right. There you go. Okay. He served in many very important assignments during World War II. And after World War II, he was commander of test services for the Enikiwak atomic bomb tests in 1954. You youngsters need to have the folks explain to you what atomic bombs are, too. Maybe you know more about that than you do the Pearl Harbor. He then followed that by system program director for the C-141 Starlifter. And for you youngsters, that's a big gray airplane you came by when you come in this morning. He helped worked on the system program director to develop the C-141, which had been a workhorse and is a little older than most of the guys flying it right now. I think that's about a true statement. And he retired as a wing commander of the C-141 outfit at Tinker Field, Oklahoma. So would you give me a warm welcome, please, for Max Hammond?
Well, I guess he told you that I wasn't a young guy. This is kind of like old home day for a couple of reasons. One, that of course, I'm going to talk about an airplane that I was closely associated with. And another thing, I see a lot of Air Force Village West people in the audience. I could have given this presentation without coming down here. I intend to talk about the requirement for the airplane, the competition, the management at Headquarters Air Force, and the System Program Office at Wright-Patterson Field. Some of the problems that we had, hi Dave, some of the problems that we had in development and production, and then a little bit about the testing. Covering a program like this in 20 to 30 minutes is, you got to give it the broad brush, but just bear with me. And I'll give you some conclusions at the end of my remarks. First off, on the background of the requirement, as a result of the Berlin airlift and the Korean War, Department of Defense found that the pre-positioning concept was inadequate to contain conflicts any place they might explode. Under the pre-positioning concept, you would stockpile people, equipment, supplies around the world at the hot spots, but there became too many hot spots, and as a result, you had to look to the amount of airlift that you had to airlift those supplies, equipment, and people wherever that hot spot might be. At the time, the only airplanes we had for that purpose were the C-124, the C-130, and the C-118. About that time, then, the Air Force developed what we called a strategic operational requirement, outlining what they thought was needed in a new airplane. And then President Kennedy came into office, and one of his first official acts was to order the development of an all-jet transport to extend the range of the nation's military forces. The aircraft was going to have to be FAA certified. This was a first for the Air Force. We had never certified an airplane that we knew that we wanted to have certified right from the start. And the purpose of that primarily was that they thought they might sell the airplane to some of the commercial operators. The airplane was certified in the end, but we never sold it to the commercial operators. That would have reduced the cost to the services if we had been able to do that. And there some cogent reasons that I think existed at the time that made that so that we didn't sell it to the commercials. Anyway, after President Kennedy's directive to the services to develop a new airplane, requests for quotation were sent out by the Systems Command to the major airframe manufacturers, Boeing, Douglas, Lockheed, and the Convair Division of General Dynamics. These were sent out along with a request for proposal also to the prime engine manufacturers, Pratt & Whitney and General Electric. Some of the design requirements in the SOR were that the aircraft would take off in 5,000 feet over a 35-foot obstacle, would land over a 35-foot obstacle in 5,000 feet, would be pressurized, of course, and would be truck level loaded, truck bed height. Also, it would have a full aerial delivery capability for cargo and for paratroopers. It had, the SOR had a number of specifications relative to testing, fatigue, and static testing. That request for proposal was sent out in December of 1960, and we requested responses by the 31st of January 1961. All of the contractors that received these RFQs complied with that and had their proposal in at that time. We compiled or assembled a group of knowledgeable people, about 100, representing the FAA, the Army, the Materiel Command of the Air Force, of course, the Systems Command, engineers of all categories, to analyze these proposals. That review was completed at the end of February 1961, and we were immediately called to the Pentagon to give a presentation to the Secretary of the Air Force and the Chief of Staff, General LeMay, and other top generals in Air Force headquarters. I made that presentation. It took about 6 hours. I'll never forget it. I had taken my top people, including my chief engineer, with me, but they wouldn't allow him or any of the other people in the room, the top secret room in the basement of the Pentagon. I think the presentation probably lasted about an hour, but then we had about a 5-hour question and answer period, which was quite something to be a part of. We went home after that presentation to write Patterson, and we felt that probably we wouldn't hear anything from it relative to a decision for some time, probably several weeks. But the presentation was given on a Friday, and on Monday when I was driving home from work, I heard on the radio that President Kennedy had announced that Lockheed was the winner and Pratt & Whitney would furnish the engine. The Air Force decided about that time on a new system of management at top level. There are about 5 major systems that were given the title designated system. And this meant that there was going to be extra special attention top level to the program. To give you an idea of what I mean by extra special attention, we had to make a presentation to the Secretary and the Chief of Staff and top generals at least once every quarter. Not only that, I had a red phone on my desk that was hooked up directly nonstop with the top echelon in the Air Force headquarters. I had the good sense, I think, to never pick up the phone and call myself. But we did get a call once in a while from people like the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Research and Development. At the Systems Command level, another new system of management was installed. Previously on major programs like this, there had been pretty much divided responsibility on the management. The Materiel Command handled the money and the contracts, and the Systems Command, Aeronautical Systems Division, handled the other components of the program. The engineers that are needed were all in the laboratories at Wright Field. In this case, the program office was given all of the resources necessary to manage all aspects of the program. We had our own engineers of all the specialties. We had people to include contract specialists, finance specialists, programming, material, testing, and production, procurement of all of the government furnished equipment. In other words, all of the resources necessary for the Air Force to manage the program were contained in the program office. The buck stopped there. We had Army representatives, we had training command representatives, we had, of course, all the program funds. We had representatives also, of course, from the Using Command, the Military Air Transport Service. In addition to the C-141 airplane, the SPO was given the responsibility of developing the 463L materials handling system. In that system, we were to modernize all of the aircraft terminals on the matched routes, to include mechanization, automation of terminals, loading equipment, the whole business of modernizing the handling system in the route structure. Our first contract went to Lockheed in about the 10th of March, I think, 1961. That was for 6 test airplanes, and very shortly thereafter, about 3 weeks later, we issued a contract to Lockheed for 127 production airplanes to be delivered over a 3-year period. The projected number total would be 285 aircraft, and the total dollar figure was estimated at that time as over $1 billion. Of course, $1 billion at that time was quite a bit of money. Today, it's a little different situation. Some of the innovations in the design of the airplane, it was to have a 25-degree wing sweep. And the reason for that was to meet the takeoff and landing requirements, the short field takeoff requirements. This presented somewhat of a problem with the FAA and other airway control agencies, because the airplane with a 25-degree wing sweep, the optimum cruising speed became about 0.7576 Mach, while the airline airplanes were flying at that time at about 0.82 Mach. The airplane was to have vertical flight and engine instruments. pilots. This was a first for a large airplane. Previously, we had vertical flight and engine instruments in some fighter aircraft, but this was a first for an airplane of this size. It was to have a T-tail. This was a first. Of course, several airplanes now flying have T-tails, but the reason for this was that it would simplify the aerial delivery problem and save some weight. The airplane was to have what we call a zero-length inlet on the engine. Normally, on a jet engine nacelle, you have the front of the engine about 6 to 8 inches back of the inlet. In this case, the airplane was designed to bring the engine up to flush with the inlet, and the reason for that, again, was to save weight. But it, in test, proved unsatisfactory. We were the first airplane in the Air Force to have a digital inertial nav and automatic landing system. Automatic landing systems, of course, today are commonplace. Ours was probably a little primitive at that time, but it was a first. Now to talk a little bit about some of the problems that we had in development and production. A lot of people, of course, think that once you've designed all the components of an airplane, all you got to do is screw them together and you're off and running. But that isn't the real life. For example, a big problem occurred early in the development phase when our mainframe forging contractor, Wyman Gordon, up in the northeast part of the United States, a very proud, capable company. They had the largest forge at that time. They had the press, the largest press at that time of anybody, I think, in the world. We found that they were running about 6 to 8 weeks behind schedule. And of course, you don't build an airplane and keep it on schedule if you haven't got the mainframe forgings. So we had a combined team of Lockheed and SPO people that went up and spent a few days with Wyman Gordon, and we reached an agreement to be able to put some of our people in the factory in order to bird dog things. This wasn't easy because that's a proud company up there and a capable company. The airplane was to have a computer that would tie all the navigation functions together and present some of the maintenance information. We had pretty normal problems giving birth to the computer. Of course, the computer manufacturer, General Precision, had to depend on a lot of sources for the data that was necessary for the computer. But through intensive effort, we were able to get the computer out on time. Weight control is always a problem in developing a new airplane. I doubt if any airplane's ever been developed that didn't have a weight problem early in the game. If you aren't careful, of course, you end up with what we might call a lead sled, an airplane that can't meet its requirements because it weighs too much. We had that problem with the 141, and early in the game, when we discovered we had one, we assembled about 50 or 60 items that we thought we ought to consider for saving weight. We had about a 3-day session down at Lockheed with our engineers from the SPO and engineers from Lockheed, and we hammered out decisions relative to all of those proposals. And we got back down to the weight that would be okay at that time. We had failures, of course, in fatigue testing and static testing. And along the line, we were given the responsibility of making the airplane capable of carrying the Minuteman missile. This required quite a bit of redesign by the engineers and production changes. But we, through burning a lot of the midnight oil, were able to keep on schedule and take care of that requirement. The number 3 aircraft lost a pedal door on flight in a load survey mission. And of course that required a redesign. We had deficiencies in and limitations in the communications and navigation systems, integration. Those are just a few examples of problems in the 141 system that we had to work around in order to stay on schedule and on cost. We had also, of course, problems with development of the 463L materials handling system. We had big 40,000 and 20,000 pound loaders that we had to develop, articulated loaders. We had to mechanize and modernize the rails and rollers in the airplanes and in the terminals. Simulator is always a problem. You want to get the first simulator to the training people as soon as you can, and at least by the time of the delivery of the first airplane, so you can start training the crews. That's always a problem because, again, the simulator manufacturer is dependent upon so much data and information coming from varied sources. One thing where we kind of failed in the program was that Chuck Wagner, the vice president of the 141 at Lockheed, Georgia, and I decided we ought to have a small ceremony at the time of rollout, which occurred in August of '63, rollout of the first airplane. But we were unsuccessful there because many government people, general officers, we had the networks that descended upon us. We had to build a huge screen so that we could show President Kennedy speaking at the time of the rollout. It ended up with a big crowd there, and I say we failed in our efforts to make it a small ceremony. First flight of the airplane was in December of '63. That was 32 months from go-ahead, and 60 years to the day from the flight of the first Wright brothers airplane. Just a side note here, the wingspan of the 141 was longer than the first flight of the Wright brothers, 60 years later. In our testing, of course, we had static and fatigue testing at various contractors. We had cold weather testing of the complete airplane at Eglin Air Force Base hangar. The airplane was in there for about a week. We had testing with the Army on airdrops of cargo and paratroopers. That was primarily at El Centro. Some of it was out of Pope Air Force Base in North Carolina. We had one accelerated test airplane, number 6, that we flew for 1,000 hours in the first 5 months and 2,500 hours in the first year. In other words, we flew that airplane around the clock as much as 12 hours a day, and that comes up, if you do your arithmetic, to about 7 hours a day for every day in the year. The reason for that was to determine weak spots in the design and also to work on the spares problem, try to figure out what spares we needed in what quantities. We took the airplane to Alaska for cold weather testing. I remember making a trip up there to see how it was going, and it was sure cold. It was minus 40 or above or below, as you want to say it, most of the time I was there. But we got a good test. The first delivery of the airplane to Tinker was in October of 1964. The first squadron at Travis Air Force Base was activated in April of '65. We received our FAA certificate from Mr. Hallaby, the head of the FAA at Dulles Airport in Washington, in a ceremony there. But before he gave us the certificate, before we had the ceremony, we had to let him fly the airplane. And we knew we were going to get the certificate because we'd worked with the working people all the way along the line. But Mr. Hallaby, I understand, pictured himself as a pretty good pilot, and he wanted to fly the airplane. So Leo Sullivan, our chief pilot at Lockheed, got in the left seat, and we put Hallaby in the right seat. Chuck Wagner, the vice president from Lockheed, and I were standing behind him. And we got up to altitude, and then Leo gave the controls in the left seat to Mr. Hallaby. And Hallaby immediately asked, well, what is the top speed of this airplane? And he was told where it was red line. And he put the airplane in a steep dive, and he hit the red line, and all of a sudden, without saying anything to anybody, he dumped the spoilers. This was like hitting a brick wall. And we had the spoilers restricted at that time, and because we hadn't certainly tested them up at the red line. And I looked around to make sure the airplane held together, and we were fortunate that it did, and we got the certificate that day with attention from the media. Mr. Hallaby at that time said that this aircraft had more military-civil cooperation than any aircraft in history, and I'm sure that that's true. Now down to a few conclusions. You're almost through, gang. I think the biggest mistake that was made in the development of the airplane was that we didn't grow it much sooner than we did. Early in the development phase, we found out that the 70-foot long cargo compartment, we would, with that, we would cube out before we would gross out considerably, as much as 20,000 pounds. In other words, if you carry a load of ping pong balls, they don't gross out the airplane. The max gross was 316,000 pounds. So we were losing payload, and I went to the Pentagon and made a presentation recommending a 23-foot plug in the fuselage, but it was denied for reasons that I don't know. I think very possibly it was because the C-5 airplane was coming along at that time, and they needed money, and they didn't want to do anything that would disturb the C-5 program. But anyway, I think that was a big mistake. In conclusion, during the Vietnam crisis, the airplane had a departure reliability of about 93 or 94% reliability, which was at that time better than the commercials were having. Also, what else was I going to say? Oh, I know. In 1967, MATS, the using command, said that the airplane had the lowest accident rate in history, in their history. The fleet hours of the airplane have greatly exceeded what the airplane was designed to do. It has had some rejuvenation, but it's held together pretty doggone well for the amount of work it's been doing. The aircraft was the first jet to land in the Antarctic, and my son-in-law was the first pilot. Are there any questions?
What's the highest time airplane in the fleet now?
I don't know, Bill. I don't know.
About 45,000 hours.
45,000 hours, yeah. Oh, by the way, in one of those presentations that I made to the Pentagon, I looked at my notes and I found that there was a Major General Harry Goldsworthy that we gave a presentation to. He happens to be sitting here today, a retired Lieutenant General.
I was director of production at this time in the Pentagon, headquarters Air Force, which meant that I was the guy that took the good news and the bad news when they came to the Chief of Staff and the Secretary of the Air Force and the Congressional Committees. And with Max Hammond program, it was good news. The C-141 was the best production program that I was ever involved in, probably one of the best of the Air Force. And it was largely due to Max Hammond's control of the program as program director. He kept the cost under control, he kept it on schedule, and it was a joy to work with the C-141 program. And he came up with a wonderful airplane that's going to serve us for a long time. A couple of things that Max was quite right. We made a mistake in not growing the airplane, and I was part of that decision. And it was money. Max had a lot of support from the congressional folks. I think he sold them a good program on just cutting the fuselage in two and put a 37-foot plug in the fuselage and extending it that far. And the congressional people wanted to do this, but we didn't have the money, and of course the C-5 was coming. I was not an engineer, and one time during and they're always snowing me with technical phrases. And during the first initial test of the first airplane, project officer worked for me came in and said, the C-141 has developed a shiggle at Mach 0.67. And I was trying to kind of buffaloed by these technical phases, but I finally said, well, what's a shiggle? And he said, something between a shake and a wiggle. It was a great program, Max, and you did a wonderful job.
That was called a shivel. I'd like to comment on what he said just a little bit. We were fortunate. We had a great team working on the system. We got tremendous support from all echelons. It was a pleasure because, you can run into rock throwers, the people that want to make a name for themselves by objecting. But we had very, very few of those. Up in the Pentagon, they can help you an awful lot when you're in a development program. Or they can stand on the road and cause you problems. In this case, we really had the support of the Pentagon. It was wonderful. They helped us keep on schedule, keep on our cost, and meet all the performance requirements. Of course, if you do that, then you get people climbing on board that might not be on board otherwise, because they like to be with a winner. But they helped make the winner. We had wonderful cooperation from the Army. We had great cooperation from the Materiel Command, from the Using Command, every place. We had people that wanted to make it go, that had the right attitude, can do, and as a result, we came up smelling pretty good. Any other questions? Go ahead.
As
as I was standing here, I was looking at all these paintings on the walls of different aircraft. And it's only been like about 100 years, as you said, that there's even been airplanes, right? So I was just kind of wondering, A, do you have any guess as to how many types of aircraft have been made altogether in the last 100 years? Because it just looks like there's an infinity of airplane types that have been made. And it made me curious, secondly, what's the average lifespan of an aircraft when there's so many people and money that go into designing an aircraft? You think it's something well thought out and serviceable, and yet it seems like another one comes along right after that. So I was just curious, what's the average lifespan? How does that work out?
You seem to have a lot of questions there. Bill Teach, do you want to help me on that?
Wow, yes.
Well, some airplanes last a long while. Look at the C-141, DC-3, still flying today. Designed in probably, about 1937 or 8, around in there. Still flying today. It wasn't probably designed to fly that long, but it has. It's been a tremendous workhorse. The B-52. The B-52 is well over 30 years old. C-141, first flight in 63. Sometimes airplanes are designed to fly maybe 25,000 hours and they go 40,000 hours like the 141. As far as how many airplanes have been designed and flown in the last 100 years, I'm a little at loss to try to tell you the answer to that one. Any other questions? Go ahead.
Yes, sir. You'd mentioned simulators and trying to get them online. Did 141 have just flight simulator, or did it also have mission and maintenance simulators?
In my time period, we only had a flight simulator. I don't know that they had any maintenance simulators. I don't know. Of course, we had ground school for all of our maintenance people, and we had mock-ups and so forth. But I don't know as we had any particular simulator for it. Any other questions? Go ahead.
Yeah, Thomas, sir. I'd just like to say thanks for building a good aircraft. Myself and some of the other Marines here, we've flown your aircraft through when we went overseas and got home always back safely. Thanks a lot.
Can somebody translate that for me? I am hard to hear.
You got everybody back.
Are you telling me to quit? Any more questions?
Next, the evolution to the Minuteman carrier. Was it ever considered to be a launcher?
Not to my knowledge.
Not to your knowledge.
Not to my knowledge, no. But that requirement could have come at us a little earlier in the program, and we'd had less trouble if we'd have designed it initially for the Minuteman missile, but we didn't. Any more questions? Well, thanks for being a good audience.
Thank you.